We flew to Bali. David Attenborough has said that Bali is the most beautiful place in the world, but he must have been there longer than we were and seen different bits, because most of what we saw in the couple of days we were there sorting out our travel arrangements was awful. It was just the tourist area, i.e. that part of Bali which has been made almost exactly the same as everywhere else in the world for the sake of the people who have come all this way to see Bali. The narrow, muddy streets of Kuta were lined with gift shops and hamburger bars and populated with crowds of drunken, shouting tourists, kamikaze motorcyclists, counterfeit watch sellers and small dogs. The kamikaze motorcyclists tried to pick off the tourists and the small dogs, while the tiny minibus, which we spent most of the evening in, shuttling our bags from one full hotel to another, hurtled through the motorcyclists and counterfeit watch sellers at video game speeds. Somewhere not too far from here, towards the middle of the island, there may have been heaven on earth, but hell had certainly set up business on its porch. The tourists, with their cans of lager and their fuck-off T-shirts, were particularly familiar to anyone who has seen the English at play in Spain or Greece. But I suddenly realised as I watched this that for once I didn't need to hide myself away in embarrassment. They weren't English. They were Australian. But they were otherwise so nearly identical that it started me thinking about convergent evolution, which I had better explain before I go on to say why they made me think of it. In different parts of the world, strikingly similar but completely unrelated forms of life will emerge in response to similar conditions and habitats. For instance, the aye, the lemur Mark and I originally tracked down in Madagascar, has one particularly remarkable feature. Its third finger is much longer than its other fingers and is skeletally thin, almost like a twig. It uses this finger for poking around under the bark of the trees it lives in to dig out the grubs which it feeds on. There is one other creature in the world which does this, and that is the long-fingered possum, which is found in New Guinea. It has a long and skeletally thin fourth finger, which it uses for precisely the same purpose. There is no family relationship between these two animals at all, and the only common factor between them is this: an absence of woodpeckers. There are no woodpeckers in Madagascar and no woodpeckers in Papua New Guinea. This means that there is a food source, the grubs under the bark, going free, and in these two cases it is a mammal which has developed a mechanism for getting at it. And the mechanism they both use is the same. Different finger, same idea. But it is purely the selection process of evolution which has created this similarity, because the animals themselves are not related. Exactly the same behaviour pattern had emerged entirely independently on the other side of the world. As in the gift shop habitats of Spain or Greece or indeed Hawaii, the local people cheerfully offer themselves up for insult and abuse in return for money, which they can then spend on further despoiling their habitat to attract more money-bearing predators. "Right," said Mark, when we found some dinner that night in a tourist restaurant with plastic flowers and music and paper umbrellas in the drinks. "Here's the picture. We have to get a goat." "Here?" "No, in Labuan Bajo. Labuan Bajo is on the island of Flores and is the nearest port to Komodo. It's a crossing of about 22 miles across some of the most treacherous seas in the east. This is where the South China Sea meets the Indian Ocean, and it's riddled with cross-currents, riptides and whirlpools. It's very dangerous and could take anything up to 20 hours. "With a goat?" I said. "A dead goat." I toyed with my food. "It's best," continued Mark, "if the goat has been dead for about 3 days, so it's got a good smell going. That's more likely to attract the dragons." "You're proposing 20 hours on a boat," "A small boat," added Mark, "on violently heaving seas?" "Probably." "With a 3-day-old dead goat?" "Yes." I hardly know what to say. "There's one other thing that I should probably say," said Mark, "which is that I've no idea if any of this is true. There are wildly conflicting stories, and some are probably just out of date, or even completely made up. I hope we'll have a better idea of the situation when we get to Labuan Bajo tomorrow. We're flying tomorrow via Beamer, and we should be at Denpasar Airport early. It was a nightmare getting these tickets and the connecting flight, and we mustn't miss the plane." We did. Fresh eruptions of hell awaited us at Denpasar Airport, which is a turmoil of crowds and shouting, with a sense of incipient violence shimmering just beneath the surface. The airline check-in man said that our flight from Beamer to Labuan Bajo had not been confirmed by the travel agent, and as a result we had no seats. He shrugged and gave us back our tickets. We had been told that serenity was the best frame of mind with which to tackle Indonesia, and we decided to try it. We tried serenely to point out that it actually said confirmed on our tickets, but he explained that confirmed didn't actually mean confirmed as such. It was merely something that they wrote on tickets when people asked them to, because it saved a lot of bother and made them go away. He went away. We stood waggling our tickets serenely at thin air. Behind the check-in desk was a window, and from behind this a thin airline official with a thin moustache, a thin tie, and a white shirt with thin epaulets sat smoking cigarettes and staring at us impassively through narrow wreaths of smoke. We waved our tickets at him, but he just shook his head very, very slightly. We marched serenely over to the ticket office, where they said it was nothing to do with them and we should talk to the travel agent. A number of decreasingly serene phone calls to the travel agent in Bali simply told us that the tickets were definitely confirmed, and that's all there was to it. The ticket office told us that they definitely weren't, and that's all there was to it. What about another flight? We asked. Maybe, they said, maybe in a week or two. A week or two? We exclaimed. Moment, said one of the men, took our tickets and went away with them. About 10 minutes later he returned and gave them to a second man, who said, Moment, and went away with them in turn. He returned 15 minutes later, looked at us and said, Yes, what do you want to know? We explained the situation all over again, whereupon he nodded, said, Moment, and disappeared again. When, after a longish while had passed, we asked where he was, we were told he had gone to visit his mother in Jakarta because he hadn't seen her in 3 years. Had he taken our tickets with him, we inquired. No, they were here somewhere, we were told. Did we want them? Yes, we did, we explained. We were trying to get to Labuan Bajo. This news seemed to cause considerable consternation, and within minutes everyone in the office had gone to lunch. It became clear that the plane was going to leave without us. We had the option of doing the first part of the flight as far as Bima, and then being stranded there, but decided instead to stay in Bali and go and deal with the travel agent. No more Mr. Serene guys. A minibus took us back to the travel agency, where we stormed slowly up the stairs with all our baggage and angrily refused to sit and have coffee and listen to a machine which played Greensleeves whenever the phone rang. There was a sense of muted horror in the air, as if one of us had died, but no one actually paid any attention to us for nearly an hour. So in the end we started to get angry again and were immediately shown into the office of the director of the agency, who sat us down and told us that the Indonesians were a proud race and that furthermore it was the fault of the airline. He then soothed us a great deal, told us that he was a very powerful man in Bali, and explained that it did not help the situation that we got angry about it. This was a point of view with which I had some natural sympathy, being something of a smiler and nodder myself, who generally registers anger and frustration by frowning a lot and going to sleep. On the other hand, I couldn't help noticing that all the time we had merely smiled and nodded and laughed pleasantly when we had been laughed pleasantly at, nothing had happened, and people had merely said moment, moment a lot, and gone to Jakarta, or peered at us impassively through narrow wreaths of smoke. As soon as we had geared ourselves up to get angry and stamp our feet a bit, we had been instantly whisked to the office of the director of the travel agency, who was busy telling us that there was no point in us getting angry, and that he would arrange an extra flight, especially for us, to Labuan Bajo. He tried to demonstrate the uselessness of stamping our feet to us with maps. In these areas, he said, pointing to a large wall map of half of Asia, it works. East of this line here, it doesn't work. He explained that if you're travelling in Indonesia, you should allow 4 or 5 days for anything urgent to happen. As far as our missing plane seats were concerned, he said that this sort of thing happened all the time. Often some government official or other important person would decide that he needed a seat, and of course someone else would then lose theirs. We asked if this was what had happened to us. He said no, it wasn't the reason, but it was the sort of reason we should bear in mind when thinking about these problems. At this point we agreed to have the coffee. He organised hotel rooms for us for the night, and a minibus tour of the island for the afternoon. There is a good living to be made in Bali, we discovered, from pointing at animals. First, find your animal, and then point at it. If you set yourself up properly, you can even make a living from pointing at the person who is pointing at the animal. We found a very good example of this enterprise on the beach near the famous temple of Tanah Lot, and apparently it was a long-established and thriving business. Up on the beach there was a very low, wide cave, inside which, in a small cranny in the wall, a couple of yellow snakes had made their home. Outside on the beach was a man who sat on a box and collected the money, and pointed at the man in the cave. Once you had paid your money, you crept into the cave, and the man in the cave pointed at the snakes. Apart from this highlight, the guided tour was profoundly depressing. When we told our guide that we didn't want to go to all the tourist places, he took us instead to the places where they take tourists who say that they don't want to go to tourist places. These places are, of course, full of tourists. Which is not to say that we weren't tourists every bit as much as the others, but it does highlight the irony that everything you go to see is changed by the very action of going to see it, which is the sort of problem which physicists have been wrestling with for most of the century. I'm not going to bang on about Bali being turned into a Bali theme park, in which Bali itself is gradually destroyed to make way for a tatty artificial version of what used to be there, because it is too familiar a process to come as news to anybody. I just want to let out a squeak of frustrated rage. I'm afraid I couldn't wait to leave the most beautiful place on earth. The following day, we finally succeeded in leaving Denpasar Airport for Bima. Everyone knew us from the ructions of the day before, and this time the narrow man who had peered at us through wreaths of smoke was wreathed in smiles and terribly helpful. This, though, was only softening us up. At Bima, we were told there was no flight at all to Labuan Bajo till the following morning. Perhaps we would like to come back then. At that point, we started to get into a bit of a frenzy, and then suddenly we were unexpectedly seized and pushed through the crowds and shoved onto a dilapidated little plane that was sitting fully loaded on the tarmac, waiting to take off for Labuan Bajo. On the way to the plane, we couldn't help noticing that we passed our pile of intrepid baggage sitting on a small, unregarded baggage cart out in the middle of the tarmac. Once we were on the plane, we sat and debated nervously with each other about whether we thought they might be thinking of loading it. Eventually, my nerve broke, and I got off the plane and started running back across the tarmac. I was quickly intercepted by airline staff, who demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I said "baggage" a lot and pointed. They insisted that everything was okay, there was no problem, and that everything was under control. I persuaded them at last to come with me to the baggage cart standing in the middle of the tarmac. With hardly a change of beat, they moved smoothly from assuring me that all our baggage was on board the plane to helping me actually get it on board. That done, we could finally relax about the baggage and start seriously to worry about the state of the plane, which was terrifying. The door to the pilot's cockpit remained open for the duration of the flight, and might actually have been missing entirely. Mark told me that Air Merpati bought their plane second-hand from Air Uganda, but I think he was joking. I have a cheerfully reckless view of this kind of air travel. It rarely bothers me at all. I don't think this is bravery, because I'm frequently scared stiff in cars, particularly if I'm driving. But once you're in an aeroplane, everything is completely out of your hands, so you may just as well sit back and grin manically about the grinding and rattling noises the old wreck of a plane makes as the turbulence throws it round the sky. There's nothing you can do. Mark was watching the instruments in the cockpit with curious intensity, and after a while said that half of them simply weren't working. I laughed, a little hectically, I admit, and said that it was probably just as well. If the instruments were working, they would probably distract and worry the pilots, and I'd rather they just got on with what they were doing. Mark thought that this was not at all an amusing observation, and he was clearly right, but nevertheless I laughed again, really rather a lot, and carried on laughing wildly for most of the rest of the flight. Mark turned and asked a passenger behind us if these planes ever crashed. Oh yes, he was told, but not to worry, there hadn't been a serious crash now in months. Landing at Labuan Bajo was interesting because the pilots couldn't get the flaps down. We were quite interested to know, for instance, as the trees at the end of the runway loomed closer and closer and the two pilots were tugging with all their combined weight on the ceiling-mounted lever, whether we were all going to live or not. At the last moment, the lever suddenly gave way, and we banged down onto the runway in a subdued and reflective frame of mind. We climbed off the plane, and after lengthy negotiations, persuaded the airline staff to take our baggage off as well, since we thought we'd probably like to have it with us.